Welcome to Broadcast Show. I'm here with Mike Leach from Workstation Specialists. Hi, Mike. We're going to do a couple of shows over the next few weeks, focusing on what's important when speccing out a digital video workstation, which is obviously what Workstation Specialists specialise in building. Today we're going to be talking about specifically CPUs, what's important to look at when you're speccing up a machine, how important it is to have a certain type of CPU, and the differences between them. So Mike, tell us a little bit about CPUs and you know...
Okay, well, the CPU as a whole, I mean, it might seem fairly obvious, but it's the central processor unit. It's the brain of the computer workstation you're using. So it's probably the most important factor when considering like the engine in a car. It kind of has the driving factor behind how fast it can go. CPU as a whole, there's probably 4 different main areas of it. Different CPU cores. It might be seen dual core, quad core, 6 core, 8 core, quite a common phrase. So the more cores you have can sometimes be beneficial. It has a clock speed, so gigahertz. So the frequency, higher the frequency, the better. Software can drive with the frequency, so typically depending on what software you have, the faster the clock speed, the better. There's onboard cache, so typically the CPU has its own internal memory, so the more cache the better. And then typically the number of CPUs you have. So depending on what type of workstation you have, whether it be single socket, dual socket, quad socket, the more CPU cores you have, the better. And we've got a various sort of setup here just to show you the differences of what it means to you and how that can be obviously be utilised in the digital video workflow. So
we've got 2 screens set up here, each connected to a different
sort of machine A, machine B. First machine is a fairly standard sort of high-end single CPU workstation, and that's got 6 cores with a technology called hyper-threading. So on Intel CPUs, you have a technology called hyper-threading, which is an additional sort of virtual cores to the operating system. So this machine's got 6 physical cores, followed by 6 virtual cores, essentially giving you 12 threads available to your computer. And then depending on what software you use, you can tap into one to all of those CPU cores to make your, obviously, software run faster.
Okay, and the other one?
We've got this one, this is a slightly different beast. This is a dual socket workstation, so it's got 2 physical processors. Each processor has 8 cores, so there's 16 physical cores there, but it also has hyper-threading. So there's an additional 16 threads, so this has a whopping 32 threads available to the operating system.
So explain threads to us.
Essentially, say a thread, a core is a physical core on the processor. A hyper-threaded core is essentially a virtual one. So I would class as a sort of an available thread. The operating system treats them as the same, but essentially then internal to the tower, internal to the processor, they are classed slightly differently. So a thread is essentially an available processing task in the system. So this machine, say it's got 16 physical, 16 sort of logical, sort of virtual set up to give you the 32 in total, and this is 6 and 6 to give you that overall 12.
So the difference between, say, a i7 dual core and something like this?
What is really hard to gauge is no 2 gigahertz can kind of be treated the same. So from an i7 to a Xeon to an AMD processor to a processor in a laptop, the gigahertz versus gigahertz is never really a fair fight. It's only when you pick a processor out of the same product family. So an i7 930 versus an i7 920, 2 main models, one's higher than the other in the range, but because they're part of the same family at the same time in terms of technology age, they can be treated like for like. If you go and pick an i7 versus a Xeon, or a Core 2 Duo or Core 2 Quad from a previous generation of Intel processors, the gigahertz kind of doesn't mean anything because they can't be repaired. It's not a fair fight. They're not